I'd worked with post-operative people before, but I still look back and feel like I failed some of these people by allowing them to feel like this was just a facet of their identity to be taken for granted and that it didn't have to do with their depression and trauma.
I'm Jane.
And I'm Beth.
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
So, hi everybody. It's just me this evening. Bex can't join us, unfortunately. And I know she's sorry to miss out because we have the amazing, the inspirational Stephanie Winn. Stephanie hosts the You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. I recommend it to anyone who wants to be a better communicator. Stephanie is a licensed child and family therapist. Qualifying in 2016, she worked in California and in Oregon. Initially, she was seen as a progressive practitioner amongst her colleagues. And then during lockdown, Stephanie started to question the whole idea of gender ideology. Unfortunately, that brought her to the attention of activists and they tried to get her licence revoked. She'll tell us a bit about that later. Stephanie wasn't beaten and she's reinvented her practice and she focuses now on families struggling with rapid onset gender dysphoria. She's developed a study program, the ROGD Repair Kit, which helps parents to improve their understanding of themselves and their teenagers. The goal is long-term improvement in family communication. Stephanie, welcome. It's fabulous to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us about those early days. You were working with young people who were suffering from gender dysphoria. What was your instinct telling you?
What I was actually feeling was unconscious resistance in the form of something in my gut just holding me back.
Yeah.
But I witnessed all the things that we talk about in gender critical land. I witnessed them up close and personal in the therapy room. You know, the young adults with trauma, autism, same-sex attraction that they hadn't grappled with, all that kind of stuff. I saw it. And gender felt like this elephant in the room that we weren't supposed to talk about, even though I was pretty good at talking about the other elephants in the room. You know, it was this like, if someone was already trans identified, then that was just something I was just sort of supposed to take for granted about them. And treat it as if that's the color of their skin.
Yeah.
It's just a fact about their demographics rather than something intimately interwoven with what they're there to talk to me about. Then in 2020, I first heard the term detransitioners. And for me, that was a pivotal moment because I felt like I needed to learn everything that I could about people who reported being harmed by this. And it immediately gave me pause as a therapist. And by that point, I'd had people at different stages in the so-called transition process as patients. But I think for a few of them, being with them from beginning to, I don't want to say end, but, you know, being with them from being just like teenage, maybe lesbians, you know, just awkward girls who'd been neglected by their families and weren't really sure how they felt about anything. And, you know, I'd witnessed them from that point into young adulthood and actually going through with the hormones and procedures. And I think the seriousness of it hadn't really hit me because I'd worked with post-operative people before, but the seriousness of it and the responsibility of my role as a therapist really hit me as I was witnessing. And by that point, again, I was not needed to write those letters. So I don't feel like I have that blood on my hands, but I still look back and feel like I failed some of these people by allowing them to feel like this was just a facet of their identity to be taken for granted and that it didn't have to do with their depression and trauma. So I just felt, you know, the moment I heard that anyone had been harmed by this and that started to line up with what I was seeing, I just felt an obligation to learn about it and sort of did an obsessive deep dive for about a year and a half before I really said anything to anyone on social media and Substack and stuff like that. I think a lot of other sort of aspects of my worldview were crumbling during that period as well due to political upheaval. and the, pandemic lockdowns and all that kind of stuff. And so I sort of entered the public arena in the fall of 2021. And within a few months of joining what was then called Twitter, trans rights activists were reporting me en masse to my licensing board for allegedly being someone who promoted conversion therapy. That was the allegation, simply because I was a therapist who was objecting to gender ideology.
And were these ex-patients of yours? I mean, did they have any reason to?
No, these were, people on the internet. And there's a lot more to that story that I won't get into right now. Suffice to say, I survived it. Mm-hmm. I'm still a licensed marriage and family therapist, but I don't think I realized that it sounds naive and silly when I say it in retrospect, but I really don't think I realized how permanently and significantly I was altering my career trajectory by entering the public arena and saying these heretical things. Mm-hmm. For better and for worse, between all the stress that it placed on my career as a therapist and the sort of ethical quandaries that I found myself navigating, but also the opportunities that came my way, because there is such a need in the broader community for concerned professionals to say something. And so as I entered that arena saying, yeah, I'm willing to say that I have this professional credential, and speaking both as a professional and as a human, these things are objectionable. I think my willingness to do that attracted a lot more just people from around the world contacting me, wanting to connect in one way or another. And so that's when I started doing consulting in addition to therapy, because not everyone was asking me to treat them as a patient. Some people just really wanted to talk about these issues and felt like I understood them in a way that was helpful to them. And it was through that process of opening up to just talking to people from around the world and applying my understanding of psychology, communication, family systems, all that kind of stuff to this particular issue. That's how I ended up sort of becoming this bizarre specialist that I am as a consultant to families dealing with this gender issue. And that's how I ended up building the course, ROGD Repair. And I really feel like, I don't know if you've heard of that Japanese term ikigai, or seen that map of the 4 overlapping circles like a Venn diagram, but it's basically the intersection of what you love to do, what you're good at doing, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. And I feel like this course is really kind of the heart of that intersection for me.
Yeah. I've listened to the podcast where you talk about ROGD a couple of times. You've got 2 or 3 that are quite detailed about it. And I've got to say, I love it. In my former life, I worked with young people, and as you've described or touched on there's such a big change between, I worked with 16-year-olds, so 16 through to 20. I worked in a college, so by the time they were 20, the difference and the growing up and the things that happened to them. And when I was listening to you talking about what happened to you as a therapist, you said that people were not changing, people were stuck in something. And so when I listened to the episodes about the ROGD repair kit, I thought, yes, this is just perfect. And what I was really struck with was that you understand how vulnerable but also how defensive teenagers are. And that is a perfect approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that gender ideology poses a threat to development. And I treat it in the course, I use this trifecta model where I think of it as not just the ideology, but also ideology working in combination with woke beliefs about social justice and cluster B personality type traits and behaviors. So I don't mean that everyone who identifies as trans has a cluster B personality disorder. That's not my point. My point is that the social contagion, the thing that is spreading through the sort of concept of a mimetic virus, if you will, involves personality disordered ways of thinking and relating to other people. And
do you want to just sort of explain what cluster B personality disorder is, just in case those of us who don't know?
Yeah, it's one of those things that has so entered the pop culture lexicon. It's funny, as someone trained in psychological concepts in grad school and postgraduate ongoing training, it's interesting to see which concepts have made it into pop psychology and TikTok culture and things like that, and which concepts nobody's heard of outside of professional circles. Cluster B is definitely one of those concepts that's gotten really popular. because everyone on social media is concerned with protecting themselves from all those big bad narcissists out there. And I understand why. If you've ever had a real run-in with, a seriously disordered individual, it can kind of scar you for life, but now there's a lot of exaggeration around it too. Anyway, narcissistic personality disorder is one of the disorders in that category. So is borderline, histrionic, and antisocial. And so these are interpersonal, relational disorders of the way a person's fundamental character structure is designed. So when we talk about the traits and behaviors, we're not necessarily, again, saying that someone has a full-blown personality disorder. Psychologists and therapists are very hesitant to diagnose personality disorders because it is a pretty serious thing. You're saying there's something wrong with the structure of this person's character. And that can take a lot of work to transform, and most people aren't motivated to dismantle the entire structure in order to rebuild it. We're looking at how does our personality form? How do we relate with other people? Are we able to relate with others on an equal playing field? Do we have an adequate enough sense of self that we can have an I-thou relationship and treat others as if they also have a sense of self that is worthy of dignity? Or do we have, as in the case of narcissism, problems with empathy, entitlement, an inflated sense of self-worth, pathological envy, and therefore willingness to manipulate and exploit? With antisocial, you're looking at not only the traits of narcissism like I just described, but you're looking at someone who gets sort of a sadistic thrill out of harming others or taking from others. With borderline, you're looking at a really unstable sense of self. Wow. And some intense interpersonal relationships that reveal a fundamental deficit in attachment, the capacity to attach healthily to others, to have a stable enough sense of self and other that we can sort of hold the good and the bad at once. Histrionic doesn't get as much attention. Everyone knows narcissistic, everyone knows borderline, and maybe not everyone knows antisocial personality disorder, but they know the terms like sociopath and psychopath, right? Histrionic, though, I think we see a lot of histrionic behavior, especially on TikTok. And that's where a lot of the influencers are. So when you take these young, vulnerable people who, again, don't necessarily have personality disorders or aren't necessarily on a trajectory where that has to become their future adult self. Mm-hmm. But when you take away mentors and role models and healthy relationships, mm-hmm. maybe you have some traits of autism, or you have a lack of the developmental experiences that help shape healthy social relating, and then you give them influencers who are behaving in histrionic ways. Yeah. Histrionic means exaggerated, superficial emotionality, attention-seeking behavior. So it has some of those elements of narcissism, the look at me, the grandiosity, but it's a lot about superficial, exaggerated demonstration. Yep. Yeah. So we see so much of that, right? Once we start looking at the term histrionic, it's you could spot it here and there and there. And this is the modeling that young people are getting about how we express our emotions.
Yeah, and I think as a teenager, you're programmed for those big mood swings and histrionics, aren't you? I remember myself as a teenager. My mum picked me up on it, saying, I hate this. If you were shopping, I hate that dress, I hate this, I hate that. I mean, it's such an extreme emotion all the time. And that's what teenagers do, don't they?
Mm-hmm. And that can contribute in a vicious cycle to an empty sense of self. Because if you're saying you hate something that you just came across 5 seconds ago and you're going to forget about 5 minutes from now, you don't really have a consistent sense of self there, do you? Because who is this self that is hating everything, every little thing that's coming and going? If your language cannot accurately sync up with your inner experience, then you're going to feel like an empty shell of a person.
So you mentioned TikTok. How much is social media and the amount of time that young people are spending online, how much does that contribute to this?
It's a big part of it. I haven't seen too many cases where it wasn't.
It's an interesting one, and it's something that parents seem to feel powerless about, don't they?
Yeah, and I specialize in what I call low leverage situations. It's not that I love or prefer working with low leverage situations. It's just that there are more resources for parents of younger kids. Once your kid's 18 or outside of the home or has some degree of independence, there's very little that you can do besides control how you communicate. So I specialize in communication tools for low leverage situations. That being said, I will always encourage people to take control of what they can control if it's earlier in the process. So I have seen parents of 13, 14, 15-year-olds prematurely acting as if they have no more power in the situation. And then, my meetings before and after those families are with parents of 20, 25-year-olds who would give anything to have as much leverage as these parents of 14-year-olds do have. So I do teach some techniques in the course, not only for taking away or reducing or monitoring internet access and smartphone usage, but for how to do that, for how to express that there will be this new boundary in place, how to replace the activities and so forth. And there's something you said earlier that I want to go back to, because you talked about developmental trajectories and how you had this experience working with 16 to 20-year-olds. And I would almost go so far as to say that every age has its own kind of flavor and personality and themes to it. Like, I work with a lot of parents of 17-year-olds, and there are some things that are really specific to being 17 because you're just on the cusp of adulthood. And I've seen cases where a parent of an 18-year-old is trying things that don't work because they now realize, because of what they've learned through gender critical people like you who are out there providing education, now they realize they should have done something differently 4 years ago, and they're trying to parent their 18-year-old in the way that they wish they'd parented that kid at 14. And I have to say, I'm sorry, you actually missed your window. And trying to control your 18-year-old who's busy proving to herself that she's finally outside of your control just isn't going to work. You missed your opportunity, so now you have to switch to the interventions that are appropriate when your kid is 18, which a lot of it involves dropping the power struggle and affirming how free they are.
Yeah. I feel desperately sorry for parents. I was talking to somebody who has a trans-identified son, and she said, you're in a bind because you want to stay with them on the journey and you're frightened to lose them, but also you don't want anyone else to influence them and lead them more astray. She said it's just so difficult. You can't do the right thing. It's really difficult.
Yeah, well, you're describing a double bind, and that's one of the concepts that I introduce in the course. And I find it's really helpful, as simplistic as this might sound, it is so helpful as a starting point to train yourself to recognize double binds as a parent in one of these situations. Because people often don't necessarily consciously recognize they're in a double bind. In other words, catch-22, rock and hard place, damned if I do, damned if I don't. Instead, they feel the anxiety that creates in them and tend to act out that anxiety impulsively through misguided efforts at controlling things, emotional outbursts, whatever their particular vice is under stress, that's where they will go. And so I teach parents instead to become consciously aware of the rock and hard place that they are caught between, and to find the language for that. And there's sort of I don't like the term mindfulness, I don't use it a lot, but there is like a mindfulness component to becoming aware of, instead of just flailing and acting out the way anyone feels when they're in that situation, just, wow, I see that if I go this way, this could happen. And if I go this way, this could happen. Seems like perhaps I'm stuck and there's no good option. Being able to talk about that with your spouse or your support network is a starting point. And eventually that's actually a place to build on in communicating with your kid as well. There are times that it's appropriate to communicate to a trans-identified child the nature of the double bind. So I use a lot of Chris Voss techniques, the hostage negotiator. His sort of classic phrase for situations like this is, how am I supposed to do that when you're put in an impossible situation? So I give a few kind of words and phrases like that, but the concept itself is very important.
what sort of parents come and do the ROGD repair kit, and how does it work for them? What sort of support do they have? What do they do?
Yeah, I mean, just based off the ones that I talk to, I would say the age range of their kids is like 10 to 30. So pretty big age range. Like I say, I love when I have an opportunity to help and advise families earlier in the process if they're new at this, if their kid is young, if there are a lot of strengths working in their favor, like evidence of a deeply trusting relationship between the child and parents, no major trauma. I love helping people in those situations, but it's all over the map. I have found myself working with a lot of immigrant families, actually. I mean, I talk to people in all English speaking countries. So I talk to people in the UK, Australia, Canada. And we're talking about immigrants from China, Iran, India, Nepal. And I think part of the reason they end up in this situation is that just the basics of the culture that they've moved to are something that they've had to learn a new language. They've had to learn new customs and habits and turns of phrase and culture. And that requires more cognitive effort on their part than it takes someone just born into that culture. So they're already kind of at a disadvantage. And then their kid, who was maybe born in this new country, and who doesn't have an accent. Yeah. Now this kid, I mean, first of all, when you say they're the expert, there can already be a little bit of a role reversal in immigrant families because sometimes the parent is relying on the child from a young age to be a translator, or even if they're not a translator, even if the parent is fluent, the child can still sense, my parent has an accent and I don't, or the child feels like a cultural translator. The child is the one explaining the culture, or the child is maybe pushing to do things more the way their friends' families do them instead of the way their family does them, which is from the other country that the child doesn't feel connected with. So there can already be like a inverted power dynamic, or if the parents' culture is very traditional, let's say conservative, or maybe they come from a culture where parents exercise a lot of control over their kids, like in some Asian families with very high expectations, where it's normalized for the parents to feel like they should have a say on what kind of career trajectory the child pursues, then there's that power dynamic as well, where maybe the child feels like my parent is trying to exert all this control over me just because that's how it's done in their country and they don't understand what it's like for my peers. And so the power dynamics are already different than power dynamics in families where everyone's coming from the same culture and country. And then I think that these parents are just even more lost than Western born non immigrant parents because this gender ideology just feels so foreign compared to the cultural background that they come from. So I do end up talking to a lot of immigrant families. Sometimes language is a barrier for them and their kids. But of course, I also talk to families where there's divorce, remarriage, and every different, family configuration that there is. I've definitely noticed the overly permissive parenting. Oftentimes, these are like good kids, which is part of why the cluster B personality traits and behaviors are so shocking and disturbing. Because oftentimes, these are not kids that parents saw as being particularly troublesome. But Jonathan Haidt talks about overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world. So for a lot of families too, there's this pattern of, during the pandemic, the lockdowns, kids had always been good, never got into trouble, always got good grades. So then they just felt like either they didn't have time to monitor everything their kid was doing because they were drowning in working from home, or whatever their situation might have been, or they just felt kind of bad for their kid not being able to see their friends. And so if the way to see their friends was gaming or Discord, or that they would allow for that. But for most of the parents I talk to are not digital natives. And so they really don't have that sense that young people have of fluency in the online world and thorough understanding of the level of danger out there. Most people, by the time they come to me, are aware and they wish they'd done things differently, but they often don't know how to walk back compromises that they made. So that's, again, where the communication tools come in.
One of the things I'm struck with when I look at how you approach things is that you spend a lot of time explaining to people, I suppose it's linked to what you've just said about how to improve communication without going head to head with your teenager. And that really struck a note with me, having worked with 16-year-olds. What things should parents avoid doing, and what things can they do instead?
Well, this is going to be a very frustrating and unsatisfying answer, but for every piece of advice that I offer in one context, the opposite is true in another. So sometimes when people first come to me, they're like flooded emotionally, and other times they're more kind of like locked up and walking on eggshells and frozen. And I often find that the parents who are flooded and overwhelmed emotionally when we first start, they need to go through a process of finding their footing and being able to kind of rise above, see clearly, take a breath before they can get more into their logical brain and think strategy and think about the ripple effects of their actions, which is part of what I train people to do. I ask them a series of questions, and we do this with the reflection questions in the course. I do this in my individual consulting. I ask people, so if you were to do that, how would your child react? And we just keep doing this over and over and over until, first of all, I have a good mental map of who is this person that we're dealing with, how does their psyche work, how's their personality, but also to help parents think about, how to at least stop shooting themselves in the foot, right? And maybe actually gain some traction. So thinking strategically, I help parents who are flooded get to a place where they can think logically. And the opposite is true as well, right? When people are really locked up emotionally, they're not speaking their truth, they're frozen, they're tiptoeing, we get into the emotions. So, for example, I often talk to parents who are still calling their child they, and it maybe was a compromise that they arrived at a while back before I met them. And they've gotten so into the habit of, let's say, calling their daughter they instead of she at home just to get along, that when they come talk to me, even though it's just me, they're still saying they instead of she.
Mm.
And I can't think of an instance where this has not happened. That when I explore that with them, and I'm like, so I'm noticing you're calling your daughter they. Tell me about that. And when I start to call them she, or I invite them to call the girl she, or by her name, or by the term daughter, that's when the emotions come out. Because the parents realize that they have been brought into their daughter's attempt to distance herself from her own female vulnerability. And by referring to their daughter as anything other than she, her, daughter, girl, they are colluding with this and distancing themselves from the tender, loving, protective feelings that they naturally have as the parent of a daughter. So when we start saying daughter, when we start saying she, that's when they start crying. That's when the truth comes out too. So the parents who are guarded and repressed and walking on eggshells, they're the ones who need to get in touch with their feelings. And sometimes, I'm met with them 5 or 10 times, and they just deliver some truth bomb, and it's so clear and powerful. And I say, well, can you say that? So some people, I advise them, oh, you absolutely need to stop letting it all hang out. You're putting way too many of your cards on the table. Here's why this isn't working strategically. Either it's creating more hostility in the relationship with your child, you're giving them all the ammo to classify you as a bigot because you're telling them how you voted or whatever, and you're feeding into their existing worldview. And sometimes it's the exact opposite. It's the people who are too busy placating and people pleasing and tiptoeing that need to be able to take those bigger emotional risks.
What do you say to the parents who hear from their children that ROGD doesn't exist? But what's the phrase that they use, that it's been discredited? ROGD has been discredited, young people will tell parents.
So we don't get into battles of wits and logic and evidence. That's very tempting for parents. There's a big lure to get into. And I've had parents that have gotten, like, before they come to me for help, they've gotten months into like email exchanges of journal articles with their kids. And we don't do that. I teach the opposite approach, actually. So we try to get to the point where the kid is drawing the information out of the parent.
And in order for your kid to draw information out of you, you have to hold it back. This is really counterintuitive. But it's very important that the kid actually be invested in hearing what you have to say, that they want to hear what you have to say. In fact, we might even make them plead with you to please tell them what you have to say. Meanwhile, you're expressing hesitancy. You're going, I hear you and I really do want to honor your request for information, or I really do want to have this important conversation to you. I know how much it matters to both of us, but I'm not sure you're going to like what I have to say. Or last time we did this, everything I had to say, you had some dismissive rationalization, and I felt like you weren't really as open-minded as you told me you were going to be. So we make the parents withhold information instead of blurting the information out till it falls on deaf ears. So when it comes to any given accusation, right? Oh, ROGD, that's been discredited. Or scientists agree that sex is a spectrum, or, any of these things. The attitude that I teach might be more about using your body language and facial expressions. Hopefully, you're having these conversations face to face as much as possible. By the way, I teach people how to do things differently over text and email, but it's about the eye contact, it's about the facial expression, it's about not giving too much, not feeding the conflict. I don't know. There's a lot to it.
Yeah. For listeners, Stephanie was pressing her lips together in a face that said, I'd like to speak, but it's not the right time.
Mm-hmm.
So what about when kids have gone no contact?
I work with a lot of people who feel afraid of estrangement looming. So we look at the evidence. What is the evidence that estrangement is looming? What is the counter evidence? What is the motivation on their part to stay engaged? For people who have already been estranged for a long period of time, sometimes they come to me and they'll schedule like a free 15-minute meet and greet. I rarely can get them to commit to working with me. If they've like not talked to their kid for a year, the sense that it's worth the investment after all the heartache they've already been through and all the times they've gotten their hopes up only to have them crushed again, and all the sort of complex, prolonged grieving that they've gone through of not knowing if their kid's okay, not knowing what drugs and surgeries they're on. I mean, for those parents to say, okay, Stephanie, I want to give it a shot, that I can find a way to reach out after this long period of estrangement, and I'm going to hire you for help with that. I don't get those people making that investment, and I completely understand why. It's a big commitment to work with me on a strategy, and you have to have some hope that it's going to work. Not to say that I wouldn't love to help those families. And like I say, I work with a lot of people who feel at risk of estrangement. Sometimes, like the whole time we're working together, we're feeling that kind of looming, and we can tell that it seems like the kids' actions are pointing toward getting out from under their parents' thumb, cutting whatever remaining financial ties, because that's usually the thing keeping them in touch. By the time your relationship with someone in your own flesh and blood has gotten to that point where it's just transactional, there's a lot that's already gone wrong.
I think it must be one of the hardest things to deal with, actually. Outside of the ROGD repair kit, that almost all of us have a neighbour, a friend, a relative, and we might want to support everybody in that scenario. We might want to support the child and keep a relationship going with that young person in the hope that they sail through this eventually. And we also might want to support the parents without judgment and without advice. What sort of advice can you give us to keep those relationships going in our life?
That's a good point. And you broke it down into the relationships with the parents and the relationships with the children, in some cases, adult children. On that latter note, mentors are so important, and we're really losing those types of relationships. I have a lesson in the course on role models, and I cover this from a few angles, but I look at the parent-child age gap and how, with women having babies at later ages, sometimes daughters are going through menarche at the same time that mothers are going through menopause. And with that age gap, you have sort of a gap in young people's perceptions of where they might be 10 or 20 years from now because their parents had them when they were older rather than younger, and because we live in this age stratified society where you're going to school with your peers and you're not seeing, as you're a teenager, you're not surrounded by people in their 20s unless you happen to have a lot of older siblings who are really thriving and close and in touch. For me, it was my older cousin. I always say this, right? She's about 15, 18 years older than me, and at least as a young person, as like a preteen, I got to see what it's like when a pretty cool, thriving young woman graduating from college and dating and having her cool apartment and her cool graphic design job. And, seeing all of that gave me at least one template in my mind for what life as a young person could be. And today, young people don't have that. They have influencers. They don't have older siblings, older cousins, cool aunties and uncles taking them under their wing, showing them this is how you make this or fix that, or this is what I do at work, or this is how I set up my first apartment, and so they're really missing those mentors and role models. So I think if you're in a position where you can be that to your friend's kid, absolutely. I mean, you're going to have some tricky stuff to navigate when it comes to decisions about what you call them, or if you're skirting around trying to avoid pronoun use, because they can tell that too. Or if you want to be that one who takes a chance on communicating directly with the kid, or, however you want to do it. But I would say try to not only be in that person's life, but teach them some skills. Show them that they're worth investing in. Teach them whatever hobbies or talents you have. Get them working on stuff and feeling how it feels to accomplish things. That's incredible, right? And then in terms of being a friend to the parents, sometimes I seem kind of cold because I so get into my analytical mind because I'm like trying to help people problem solve. And I have some, consulting clients who they love that. They're looking for really direct coaching. In terms of being a friend, I think a lot of what I hear from people who are friends to parents going through this is sympathy and not wanting to overstep, not wanting to advise. It's tricky there because you don't want a parent who is your friend to lose their sense of self in this. You don't want them to lose their identity to feelings of perpetual victimization. And you don't want their whole world to be about gender, because then there's this whole other destructive parallel process where the kids in their room going down the rabbit hole of pro-trans online content and the parents in their room going down their rabbit hole of, for lack of a better word, so-called anti-trans content. And they're like mirror images of each other, and they're both worked up and emotionally dysregulated and disconnected. And it's not a constructive use of anyone's time. So if that is your friend, that parent who's in their room, on their computer, not sleeping well, not getting along with their spouse, not doing the things that they loved, and starting to develop, whether it's like a frozen affect where they're disconnected from themselves, or whether they're kind of falling into self-pity or despair, you don't have to just coddle them and tiptoe around them. You can also be that person who's anchoring them in their identity of who they are as a whole person, especially if you knew them before they became a mom or dad. You can help them reconnect with their interests and hobbies and self-care and have a laugh. And that is going to do more for the parent-child relationship and for that trans-identified child. The parent being well and well-rounded is going to do more than just your pure sympathy.
Yeah, yeah. I know when you first find out about this, the temptation is to tell everybody else about it and send them articles and podcasts and so on. And it's not a good idea in this situation, is it?
Well, I mean, I know a lot of people who have done the opposite, where they're just worried about how they'll be seen by their friends and family. I mean, this can be really isolating, especially if you're in blue states or, culturally liberal, as I like to call it. Like I'm a cultural liberal. My taste in music and art and food, is very like West Coast. So depending on your social environment, yeah, I mean, you might be emailing everyone you know about it, but you also could be losing trust in people and
Yeah, yeah.
isolating.
It's very, very difficult. We're so glad to have spoken to you about this, because I do think it's an important message to get out there, and I'm hopeful that parents and friends of trans-identified young people will listen and have a better idea of how to approach and deal with the communication, as you say, some of these issues. We always finish in the same way. We ask you for a woman of the moment. There's so many inspirational women out there. You were one of ours. So if you were passing that on, who would you suggest?
Because I was thinking about this before we started recording, and you told me you were going to ask me this question. And I was thinking about giving a shout out to my friend Amy Sousa. She's surviving breast cancer and remaining an advocate for women's rights. And I do want to give a shout out to her. And, I also think Heather Hying is an incredible mentor and role model. But you know who I actually am going to give this to right now is Katie Faust. Do you know Katie Faust?
I do, yes, but would you like to?
So, what I really respect about Katie is that she has such a clear sense of her purpose in life, and that her purpose is to be an advocate for the truth about what children need,
Yeah.
no matter how adults feel about it. And some of the stuff she says hurts adults' feelings and is inconvenient towards adults' desires, but she maintains a central focus. And I met her, and she's fiercely compassionate, but she never lets her compassion affect her willingness to speak the truth about, how things like surrogacy are harmful to children, for example. And I just think we need a lot more of that today.
Focus on children. That's a wonderful place to stop, really. Amy Sousa has appeared before, actually, as our woman of the moment. I think Cara Dansky chose Amy Sousa.
Oh, nice.
So you were very generous and said to us that if people listening to this wanted to try the ROGD repair kit, there was a code attached to our programme, which we're delighted about, because it would just be so nice for us to think that the listening to this done some positive good. So we're going to add the code at the bottom of the details when we stream it. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about where you can be found and how people can listen to more of you, find out more about you?
Yeah, sure. So just to recap that, the ROGD repair program is at rogdrepair.com, and you can use code INSIGHTFUL, spelled the same way it's spelled in the title of your podcast, to take 50% off your first month of membership. And as far as me, I am on X, but my account has been locked for a while just to minimize the stress of the public
What a surprise.
forum. So my handle there is at SomeTherapist. My podcast website is sometherapist.com. That's short for You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. And then to learn about my consulting services and stuff like that, that is stephaniewinn.com.
Well, Stephanie, it's been just superb. Thank you so much. It's been fabulous. It's been so interesting.
It was really nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for speaking to us, and thank you for listening for this long. We hope that you've really enjoyed this episode, and if so, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and we really hope to see you in future episodes too.